Thank you very much. I'm not quite sure what happened, but Paul definitely sent me an email saying he wanted me here tonight. Oh, I'm here. And whatever else you were expecting, you've got John Betjeman to look at. And John Betjeman once attended a lecture that he had seen advertised, The Joys of Reading, only to find that when he got there, it was actually The Joys of Reading in Berkshire. So maybe if I'm not quite what you were expecting, maybe you will still get something out of it. Just to introduce myself a little bit more, at different times in my life, I've been a ship's engineer, I've been a school teacher, I've been an associate lecturer with the Open University as well. But I come here really to share my enthusiasm for the late Sir John Betjeman. And 2 weeks ago tonight, a number of us gathered in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey after evensong to mark and commemorate 40 years since John Betjeman died. And remarkably, people still remember him. And I brought along a number of books, and on the table there's 4 books about John Betjeman that have been published in the last 4 years. So he's still very much of interest and very, very, very current. John Betjeman visited many places in Britain, and there are many places that are associated with him. You may be familiar with Highgate in London, Cornwall, Oxford, Berkshire, but today I want to show you that the unregarded county of Lincolnshire was also a significant part of John Betjeman's picture of our country. John Betjeman loved places that were unregarded, and he loved the county of Lincolnshire. He often visited friends in the county. He wrote a number of poems that are firmly located in the county, and he also wrote about the landscape and architecture of our county. But perhaps I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Who was John Betjeman? He was a poet, a journalist, a celebrity, a television personality, an early conservationist and campaigner, but above all, he was a man who taught us how to look at the world around us. And I do like to visit groups, sometimes of us, how can I put it tactfully, of a certain age. I think the age profile here is actually quite a bit younger than many of the groups I speak to about John Betjeman. So if there are folk here who've not heard of John Betjeman, I hope there'll be something of interest to you, whether you're interested in poetry, preservation of our heritage or our local area, whether you know anything about John Betjeman or not. I want to start at the end, and that was 40 years ago. John Betjeman's funeral on a blustery, windswept day in May 1984. He was buried at this church, St Enodox Church, at Trubetherick in Cornwall. It's one of the most inaccessible churches in the country. It has no vehicular access. The funeral procession carrying John Betjeman's coffin had to cross half a mile of footpath tracks, and his coffin was carried by old friends across the golf course to get to the church. And these friends were dressed in oilskins and sou'westers in the driving rain that there was on that day. And people who were there said it looked like a lot of wreckers coming ashore. Very much a Cornish image there. They sheltered for a moment under the lich gate, rested the coffin on the coffin rest, and behind the coffin were John Betjeman's family and close friends. There was Penelope, his wife, for over 50 years, his children, Paul and Candida. But there was also Lady Elizabeth Cavendish, John Betjeman's companion for the last 30 years of his life, if you like, his second wife, although he never divorced Penelope. And I think that's typical of the love and affection in which he was held, that his bohemian relationships could be played out and sustained to the end there. And there's his grave. 40 years he's been buried there, but today his grave is well worn and much visited. Well, the grass around it is well worn. John Betjeman is not forgotten. Hopefully we can discover something of why. John was born in 1906 at the foot of Highgate Hill in London. His father was Ernest Betjeman, a cabinet maker, whose firm made the Betjeman Tantalus, a patented decanter device to keep the servants from purloining the port. And the family, as they got more prosperous, moved up West Hill in Highgate. And John actually continued that social climbing throughout his life, ending up as a friend of members of the royal family. And the key to John's social climbing was his time at Oxford in the 1920s, where he was part of the literary set. He was a friend of Evelyn Waugh. And one of the affectations that John Betjeman had, not just when he was at Oxford University, but throughout his life, was he had a teddy bear. And Archibald, his teddy bear, was inseparable from him. But think about Evelyn Waugh, Brideshead revisited the character of Sebastian, who always carries a teddy bear. Where did Evelyn Waugh get that idea from? Well, it was from John Betjeman. John left Oxford without a degree, and just like many people who aren't quite sure what to do with their lives, he became a schoolmaster. And then he went on to become the assistant editor of the Architectural Review. In the 1930s, he married the Honourable Penelope Chetwood, daughter of Field Marshal Lord Chetwood, who was head of the army in India. And Penelope's mother said to her, "John is the sort of person we invite to dinner, but we do not marry them." And so John and Penelope eloped and were married secretly. When the news was broken to Penelope's parents, the problem arose of what to call his father-in-law. "You can't call me father. Sir is too formal. Just call me Field Marshal." And in the 1930s, working for the Architectural Review, John Betjeman began to edit the shell guides for the Shell Motor Company. And here you see the start of his idiosyncratic design and his love of typography, harking back to the Victorian period. He mixed with a range of new British artists. One of them you may have heard of, Edward Borden, and this is an advert in the Shell Guide for Shell, but the important thing about it is the illustration is by Edward Borden. So it says Bradford on Avon, but Shell on the road. Perhaps it doesn't cut the mustard today, but notice the strapline at the bottom. You can be sure of Shell. That was one of John Betjeman's. And they used that well into the 1960s and 70s in their advertising. Other literary people around at the same time also got into advertising. So we have Dorothy L. Sayers, who came up with "Guinness is good for you." And my goodness, that was an advertising slogan that continued 4 years. Here's another one in the same vein. Another Edward Borden illustration. Stoke Gabriel in Devon, but Shell needs no stoking. Well, perhaps, as I say, it doesn't cut the mustard today. During the war, John Betjeman was press attaché to the British representative in Ireland. So I tried to get a photograph of him looking a bit shifty. Because really, he was a spy working for the Ministry of Information in Ireland. And many years later, it was revealed that the IRA had considered assassinating him. However, they read his poems about Ireland, which showed his appreciation of that country, and decided against it. So he was saved by his own country. John returned to England, settling in Berkshire, then Oxfordshire, dividing his time between family life in the country and his writing in London, where he rented a flat at Cloth Fair, one of the few residential properties in the city of London. And today, you can still see where his flat was, above a wine bar. For a short time, it was named Betjeman's. It's no longer named that, but his flat was above that wine bar. And there's a blue plaque that marks where he lived, and you can actually stay in his flat under the auspices of the Landmark Trust, which is a rather nice thing to do in a flat in London with William Morris wallpaper and shelves of John Betjeman books. Now, this divided life between country and town was useful because John met Lady Elizabeth Cavendish in 1951. She was lady in waiting to Princess Margaret, and they met at a dinner party in 1951. No words were exchanged on that evening, but they both knew something had happened. Their host was a little on edge because one of the guests hadn't turned up, so there was an empty seat at the dinner table, and that seat was earmarked for Guy Burgess, but he had gone to Russia that evening. And there was another chap at the same dinner party looking distinctly uncomfortable. His name has just gone out of my head, but he was the fifth man, the surveyor of the Queen's pictures. But he was part of that group. John Betjeman, you may recall, appearing on Parkinson on the television. He became this avuncular figure in the 1950s and 60s, a celebrity before the age of celebrity. And he appeared on Parkinson at least 3 times. He commented on architecture and campaigned to save threatened buildings, especially Victorian architecture. And most notably, he campaigned to save St Pancras Station in London. His poetry was very successful. This is from his publisher, who claimed in 2006 that John Betjeman's volumes of poetry had sold more than 3 million copies. Now that's quite remarkable, isn't it? And in 1976 he was given a great accolade. He appeared on the cover of the Radio Times. He was also knighted in 1969 and became Sir John Betjeman. 1972 he was appointed as Poet Laureate. Now, poetry was his most important writing. It's what he wanted to be judged by. And we're going to start off, I've got 3 poems to read tonight. First is a popular example of his poems. One he described as his crowd pleaser. And it dates from 1941. A Subaltern's Love Song. Miss J. Hunter Dunn, Miss J. Hunter Dunn, furnished and burnished by Aldershot sun. What strenuous singles we played after tea, we in the tournament, you against me. Love 30, love 40, oh weakness of joy, the speed of a swallow, the grace of a boy. With carelessness gaily you won. I'm weak from your loveliness, Joan Hunter Dunn. Miss Joan Hunter Dunn, Miss Joan Hunter Dunn, how mad I am, sad I am, glad that you won. The warm-handled racket is back in its press, but my shock-headed victor, she loves me no less. Her father's euonymus shines as we walk, and swing past the summer house buried in talk, and cool the veranda that welcomes us in to the 6 o'clock news, and a lime juice and gin. The scent of the conifers, the sound of the bath, the view from my bedroom of moss-tappled path, as I struggle with double-end evening tie, for we dance at the golf club, my Victor and I. On the floor of her bedroom lie blazer and shorts, and the cream-coloured walls are betrophied with sports, and westering questioning settles the sun on your low-leaded window, Miss Joan Hunter Dunn. The hillman is waiting, the lights in the hall, the pictures of Egypt bright on the wall. My sweet, I'm standing beside the oak stair, and there on the landings the light on your hair. By roads not adopted, by woodlanded ways, she drove to the club in the late summer haze, into 9 o'clock Camberley, heavy with bells, and mushroomy, pinewoody, evergreen smells. Miss Joan Hunter Dunn, Miss Joan Hunter Dunn, I can hear from the car park the dance has begun. O full Surrey twilight, importunate band, O strongly adorable tennis girls, and around us are Rovers and Austins afar, above us the intimate roof of the car, and here on my right is the girl of my choice, with the tilt of her nose and the chime of her voice, and the scent of her wrap and the words never said, and the ominous dancing ahead. We sat in the car park till 20 to 1, and now I'm engaged to Miss Joan Hunter Dunn. Now, that poem is firmly fixed in terms of location. Did you notice how he used place names? It's firmly fixed in terms of social class, albeit his own social class. And did you see how he used product names to evoke a time that is now past? It's a really good example of why John Betjeman is considered a writer of light verse. But that poem actually tells him a lot about his life and his loves. He said, "The girl on my right is the girl of my choice." So, who was in the driving seat? It wasn't John. It was Joan. He liked women who were slightly dominant. One of his poems, he wrote about the Olympic girl. He said, "The kind of girl I like to see is one who looks down on me and stands in strong athletic pose and wrinkles her retroussé nose." However, not all John's poems are light and humorous. Darker themes emerge. Love, loss, guilt, death, and melancholy, they're all there. He also used his poems to campaign. And this poem is from a few years later. It's called Inexpensive Progress. Encase your legs in nylons, bestride your hills with pylons, O age without a soul, away with gentle willows and all the elmy billows that through your valleys roll. Let's say goodbye to hedges and roads with grassy edges, and winding country lanes. Let all things travel faster, where motor car is master, till only speed remains. Destroy the ancient inn signs, but strew the roads with tin signs. Keep left, M4, keep out. Command, instruction, warning, repetitive adorning the rockeried roundabout. For every raw obscenity must have its small amenity, its patch of shaven green, its hoardings look a wonder in banks of floribunda, with floodlights in between. Leave no old village standing which could provide a landing for aeroplanes to roar, but spare such cheap defacements as huts with shattered casements, unlived in since the war. Let no provincial high street, which might be your or my street, look as it used to do, but let the chain stores place here their miles of black glass fascia and traffic thunder through. And if there is some scenery, some unpretentious greenery surviving anywhere, it does not need protecting, for soon we'll be erecting a power station. When all our roads are lighted by concrete monsters sighted, like gallows overhead, bathed in the yellow vomit, each monster belches from it, we'll know that we are dead. So he used his poems to campaign against the loss of environment and amenity. And that's just one example. But I want us to look now for a few moments at a conference that took place here in Lincolnshire in 1963. It was the Lincolnshire Past, Present and Future Conference. And John Betjeman, who, as I mentioned earlier, was a frequent visitor to the county, he was the keynote speaker on this conference that took place in the 1960s, and it did much to change the attitude of people in the county towards the arts and heritage. And it took place on a Monday morning at the Theatre Royal, and John Betjeman said, "It's a great honour to be asked to this conference and make its opening speech. What impresses me tremendously is the way you've turned out for it. I don't think there's another county where you would get people to come and sit in a theatre on a Monday morning, a most awful time in the week. It means you really care about the arts and heritage. I understand, I think, why you come. It's because Lincolnshire is so singularly beautiful, and because it is, I think, a separate country. I would like to see it with its own flag and needing passports to get in." Well, it took a while, but early in the 21st century we got our own flag, didn't we? But there we are, that's foresight. And John described Lincolnshire as being so beautiful, so unobtrusively beautiful, saved from much hideous destruction by the Humber stopping things going through. And he spoke about how he woke up the previous morning, or that morning I should say, in his friend Jack Yates's mother's house in Westgate in Louth. And he described looking down the line of Westgate towards the wonderful church at Louth. And he said, "I could see in that sharp winter morning sunlight the different browns and reds and pale biscuits of the bricks, which is such a feature of Lincolnshire. Dark red for the 17th century and brighter reds for later periods until you get to the yellow brick of the Regency. And I saw the curve of these houses, each with its garden and a little bit of lawn and a shadowy cedar, arching round past the winter trees and that spire of Louth. in the winter sunlight superbly proportioned. You will notice always in Lincolnshire, he said, in village and town, where there's an old church tower and a road leading to it, the road curves round so that you see two sides of the tower. Now, John was a great friends with the Louth bookseller Jack Yates, and he was also friends with Canon Henry Thorold, and in Louth today you can still see the distinctive bow window that was where Jack Yates had a bookshop. But John got his two Lincolnshire friends, Jack Yates and Henry Thorold, to put together the Shell Guide for Lincolnshire in the 1960s. And at first John approached Jack Yates telling him, of course, Henry will do all the work. And then he asked Henry Thorold, assuring him that, of course, Jack will do all the work. But actually between them, they produced a first-class guide to the county of Lincolnshire that is still relevant today. John had many friends in the county. This is Meg Penning Rousel, born Margaret Wintringham, and John inscribed a book to her, Margaret Wintringham, with love from her loving chum and admirer, John Betjeman. But notice his sketch of a Lincolnshire landscape. He often described Lincolnshire as being a landscape of three-quarters sky. And that's exactly how he's drawn it, with the telegraph poles disappearing off into the distance. And it was with Margaret Wintringham that John Betjeman visited Bayon's Manor near Tealby, one of Lincolnshire's lost country houses. And they picnicked in the overgrown grounds there. And John and Meg broke into the house and discovered a suit of armour there, which they brought to the window. The children who were with them thought they would get caught, but it was a great adventure apparently. And this is John in the grounds of Bayon's Manor, and that wonderful building, that Lincolnshire country house, was demolished using dynamite in the 1960s. Now, back to John Betjeman's words at the Lincolnshire conference. He said it's very important we should leave Lincolnshire something like the Lincolnshire that Tennyson knew. And many people have found echoes of Tennyson's poems in Betjeman's poetry, either in phrases or in form or metre. But that was the result of a lifelong love of Tennyson, an absorption of his poetry on the part of John Betjeman. John explained why he'd written his own verse autobiography called Summoned by Bells in blank verse. He said, I wrote it thinking it's the best way to write about being young. I was thinking of Tennyson's idylls. And he recognised Tennyson as a landscape poet. One of his favourite Lincolnshire landscapes was actually the Lincolnshire coast that Tennyson writes about. And John made a documentary film about Tennyson. He visited Somersby, and where Tennyson was born in the rectory and spent his youth there. And John Betjeman's daughter, Candida Lycett Green, said this about Somersby Church, just across the road from the rectory. My father, John Betjeman, loved Somersby Church with a passion and first took me to see it when I was about 13. Although he had often made pilgrimages to it before, his delight on first walking in was evident. This had a lot to do with the thought of his great hero, Alfred Tennyson, having worshipped there. We sat in silence for several minutes. Tennyson's spirit is indeed all-pervading, but St Margaret's is a wonderful church in its own right, a true haunt of ancient peace. And if you know the church at Somersby, as John Betjeman did, inside there's a memorial bust of Tennyson there. And John did much to promote Tennyson and his work at a time when it had fallen out of fashion. He made long-playing records. Do you remember those? I think today they're called vinyl, aren't they? But he made long-playing records of recordings of Tennyson's poetry and interviews with Sir Charles Tennyson, Tennyson's grandson, who could remember Tennyson. So John knew people who remembered Tennyson, something we can't do today. Look out for this Lincolnshire book. It's well worth collecting. It's called the Tennyson Album, and it's photographs by Juliet Margaret Cameron of Tennyson and his circle. But it's got an introduction by Sir John Betjeman. But it's written and published in Lincolnshire. In 1950, John Betjeman had written that Tennyson was the last Englishman to make a decent living by writing poetry. And when John Betjeman himself died, another great poet, Philip Larkin, was quick to sum up Betjeman's achievement. Not since Tennyson, he said, has a poet won such renown. Really quite a wonderful accolade. Now, other things that John Betjeman loved about our county included place names. He said the names of the villages in the county are marvellous. Clixby, Claxby, Pluckacre, Ashby, Puerham, Bag Enderby. It's marvellous that they're still there for us today. And John loved churches. He wrote a guide to English parish churches, and when writing his introduction to the county of Lincolnshire in this book, he said, Lincolnshire is the second largest county in England and the least appreciated. In a letter to George Barnes in 1946, he said, this county is an unspoiled Sussex, only with better churches. Keep it dark. He didn't want people to find out about how wonderful the churches are in Lincolnshire. He started his church crawling, as he called it, in Lincolnshire at Kirkby-on-Bane when he was still a student at Oxford University. And his friend Noel Blakiston, his father had the living at Kirkby-on-Bane. And John Betjeman's liking for place names, Carlton, Scroop, Clixby and all of that, coupled with his time at the Blakistons, inspired his poem called A Lincolnshire Tale. And that starts off, Kirkby with Muckby, come Sparrowby, come Spinks, is down a long lane in the county of Links. And apart from the reference to Kirkby, the rest is a fictitious blend. And that poem was published in a book called Church Poems, illustrated by John Betjeman's artist friend, John Piper. And the church that they used to illustrate it was the Golfo Church, which is in the care of the Churches Conservation Trust. formerly the Redundant Churches Fund, which John Betjeman was instrumental in creating. Sadly, this lovely little building was almost completely destroyed a few years ago in an electrical storm and a lightning strike. But here it is in happier days, as it would have looked when John Betjeman and John Piper visited it. And we know that when John met the key holder, he impressed him with his knowledge of country matters. Other fine churches in the county that John loved include St James's Church, Louth, the lovely Georgian Church at Langton by Partney, completely unspoiled with a 3-decker pulpit and box pews, and it's lit by oil lamps. And sometimes in the summer they have concerts there. It's a magic place. And he loved the church at West Keel, St Helen, and in particular he wrote about the capitals featuring a fox holding a chicken, a monkey on a chain, and women almost bursting out of their bodices. I think you can see why he admired that. John's friend, Canon Henry Thorold, he lived down at Marston Hall, near this spectacular church with its brooch spire, Marston Church. John Betjeman never stayed at Henry Thorold's house. It was too cold. He preferred the comfort of the central heating at Jack Yates's mother's house at Louth. Another of his favourite churches in Lincolnshire was Belton Church. Now today Belton House is the flagship of the National Trust, but it's worth visiting the lovely little parish church of St Peter and St Paul's, notable for its collection of Brownlow family monuments. There were so many, in fact, that it said that Belton Church was built to the glory of the Brownlows and in memory of God. But incredibly, in that church, we've got a sculpture by Canova. Now, people go to the Louvre in Paris to see Canova sculptures. And we've got one here in Lincolnshire. And John Betjeman knew about it and drew our attention to it. Now, John was a great admirer of the Gothic Revival church architect George Frederick Bodley. And in Summoned by Bells, he refers to being safe in Bodley's greens and browns. And this is a Bodley church at Brant Bruton, St Helens, Brant Bruton. And John Betjeman reckoned that some churches are worth bicycling 12 miles against the wind to see. And he marked those in his Collins Guide with an asterisk. And St Helens, Brant Bruton is one of those churches. So our last church that we're going to finish with, and our last poem, is a poem called A Lincolnshire Church. And this poem was the result of a visit to St Margaret's Church at Huttoft in Lincolnshire in the 1950s. And John wrote this poem. Judge for yourself how accurate his poetic description is of this beautiful church. If all else fails, look it up in the index. It's even got a bookmark in that says a Lincolnshire church. It slipped down a bit. A Lincolnshire church. Greyly tremendous the thunder hung over the width of the wold, but here the green marsh was alight in a huge cloud cavern of gold, and there on a gentle eminence, topping some ash trees, a tower, silver and brown in the sunlight, worn by sea wind and shower, Lincolnshire middle pointed, and around it turning their backs, the usual sprinkle of villas, the usual woman in slacks, cigarette in her mouth, regretting Americans, stands as a wireless croons in the kitchen, manicuring her hands. Dear old bloody old England, of telegraph poles and tin, seemingly so indifferent and with so little soul to win. What sort of church, I wonder? The path is a grassy mat, and grass is drowning the headstones, sloping this way and that. Cathedral glass in the windows, a roof of unsuitable slate, restored with a vengeance for certain, about 1888. The door swung easily open, unlocked for these parts is odd, and there on the south aisle altar is the tabernacle of God. There where the white light flickers, by the white and silver veil, a wafer dipped in a wine drop, is the presence the angels hail. Is God who created the heavens and the wide green marsh as well, who sings in the sky with the skylark, who calls in the evening bell. Is God who prepared his coming with fruit of the earth for his food, with stone for building his churches, and trees for making his rood. There where the white light flickers, our Creator is with us yet, to be worshipped by you and the woman of the slacks and the cigarette. The great door shuts and lessens that roar of churchyard trees, and the presence of God incarnate has brought me to my knees. I acknowledge my transgressions, the well-known phrases rolled, with thunder sailing over from the heavily clouded wold, and my sin is ever before me. There in the lighted east, he stood in that lowering sunlight, an Indian Christian priest. And why he was here in Lincolnshire, I neither asked nor knew, nor whether his flock was many, nor whether his flock was few. I thought of the heaving waters that bore him from sun glare harsh, of some Indian Anglican mission to this green enormous marsh. There where the white light flickers, here as the rains descend, the same mysterious Godhead is welcoming his friend. And that poem, as well as being a really good description of a church that's still there today that you can identify, John also describes the people that he met. And one of the people he mentions is the incumbent, the Indian Christian priest. That was the Reverend Theophilus Caleb, 1878 to 1959. And if the Indian Christian priest was there, I'm sure the woman with the slacks and the cigarette was there as well. And a Lincolnshire poem is an important poem, not only because it describes the externals, but it gives an insight into John's own faith and doubt. He says, my sin is ever before me. And that was an important aspect of his life. The fact that although he was married to Penelope, he was also with Lady Elizabeth Cavendish for 30 years. And he held those two things in intention. So that comes out in that poem. I think John Betjeman is most remembered for today is at St Pancras Station. This sculpture by Martin Jennings was unveiled in 2007, and as you walk past it next time you're in St Pancras, notice John's tummy. It seems to have developed a patina where people touch it with affection as they go past. 40 years after his death, John Betjeman, friend of Lincolnshire, is still remembered. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So, really do appreciate.
Don't know if anyone's got any questions. I'm always happy to answer questions. Yes?
Is your tie a homage?
It is. It's, how kind of you to notice. It's got teddy bears on it. So, a homage to John Betjeman's teddy bear Archibald. But thank you, how kind. Yes?
I think it's right, and mentioned in the last poem about being unusual for the church to be open. I thought in 1958 it would have been unusual for a church not to be open.
Well, it's what he wrote in
Yeah.
at that time.
And the other observation, the house in Westgate in Ralph, I believe it's a house, and I don't know whether it was at that time, but a little later was where the Bishop of Grimsby lived.
Right.
Certainly in the 1970s, when it was Bishop Gerald Collier, when I was a child growing up, the Bishop of Grimsby lived at that house.
Quite possibly. It's a beautiful house.
It is.
But it was Jack Yates' mother's house.
Yeah, interesting.
But John Betjeman writes about the sort of 1640-ish window panes and looking out and panelled rooms.
And the bookshop, that was, the bookshop was originally in Goldings, wasn't it?
Yes, on Mercer Road. Yes. Thank you. One more question.
Yes, I'm just showing my ignorance, I think. Was it Betjeman who wrote the one about the mail train?
No.
The film Night Mail, yeah.
Night
Mail.
Mail, no. No, it was W.H. Orwell.
Thank you.
But everybody thinks he did.
Yes.
Because of course, we haven't really even touched on it, but steam trains and railway lines and branch lines are again part of John Betjeman's oeuvre.